Extremely warm welcome to me. I'm very glad to be here. I'm a product of the English department of Bombay University. I did my MA and PhD from this department. My MLit, as Rakesh mentioned, is from FLU, which was at that time 79 when I graduated from there. It was called Central Institute of English and Foreign Languages, CIFL. So I was there for 2 years, 77 to 79. I did my MA in 1974 and started teaching in Bombay colleges. However, the situation was not very conducive for language teachers since Maharashtra was switching over from 11+4 to 10+2+3. So the situation for younger teachers was not very conducive. So I decided to go for research. And I went to Hyderabad to CIFL, now called FLU.
Yeah.
And I specialized in linguistics and phonetics. So my background, my parental background, I'm lucky to have parents who allowed me to follow my inclination. I became interested in music in my college days and pursued a parallel career in vocal classical music, Hindustani music. But I basically, professionally, I'm a teacher of English literature. Now, what English literature means to all of us is something very different. Okay. When I did my BA in late 60s and early 70s and MA in early 70s, I was exposed to an exclusive study of English literature. And by English, it does not mean literature written in English, but it was exclusively literature from England, literature at the most from Britain. But it did not include, we had separate courses in American literature and English literature in other countries, okay? So Commonwealth and so on and so forth. So it was not, the definition of English literature was confined then. English literature then and now, quite different. The literature itself was exclusively confined to, there were courses in American literature. When I did my BA in Elphinstone College, they offered me a subsidiary course, a minor course in British history, which was very useful for me. Okay, my background is from Marathi medium school and my father was a professor of Marathi, but he encouraged me to go in for doing literature in English. So when I joined the MA course, coming with the background of British history and English literature from Elphinstone College in 1970, 71, 72, we were offered a course in art and aesthetics by Professor R.B. Patankar, who was a professor of English literature and of aesthetics, mainly philosophical aesthetics and literary aesthetics. But in that course, we also had an exposure to painting and music as allied arts, arts allied to literature. So it was not purely a course on literary aesthetics and so on. I'll come back to that. And the criticism that we were taught at that time, I will not mention now too much about the BA part of it. BA, we had some introductory book by, I don't remember now, but some introductory book on criticism. And it appreciated, it introduced us concepts of appreciation, validation, and so on. But the critical terminology was quite different in 70s, quite different from what it is today in the 21st century. I have taught criticism and aesthetics courses at Bombay University. I also taught them at the IIT. I joined IIT in 1981 and retired from that institute in 2017 after 36 years of service. I started courses in art and aesthetics. I started courses, elective course in art and aesthetics. I started an elective course in appreciation of Hindustani music, its aesthetics and its practice, and so on. That was for the BTech students. And for PhD coursework, we had a PhD program ever since I had joined in humanities and social sciences, and we used to admit about 19 or 20 students have completed their doctoral thesis with me. And in diverse topics, as it has been mentioned. Let me begin with a kind of questions we are going to discuss. I don't have ready-made answers to any of these questions. Okay, we will begin with a set of exploratory questions. I don't want to make it an expository kind of approach. We need to approach it in an exploratory way. Now, my first question is in this regard about criticism. Is criticism a part of literature? Can you say criticism is literature, is a branch of literature? Now, there's no easy answer to it. You have included it in every course in literary studies. So it's definitely a part of literary studies. But is criticism itself literature? Debatable. Criticism is a kind of analysis of literature. Now, if you compare courses in music to courses in literature at BA or MA level, bachelor's of masters, the main difference is in the other arts like dance, music, drama, performing arts, or even painting. The master's degree incorporates creative output, while English studies conventionally does not have a paper in a compulsory paper. I think in Pune University they did try, and some of the universities in India, it's a very late attempt to incorporate creative writing within courses of literature. We study literature critically at the level of appreciation, research, learning, etc. But in the teaching and learning of literature, literature in academies, institutes, universities, we have a canon to study, canon of texts which are fictional or literary, quote unquote. And that definition of literature was got formalized around 19th century in, say, England and in Europe. So this was the kind of belles lettres tradition, the creative writing tradition which we study. And that criticism is not a part of that. Criticism is a separate kind of discipline which approaches literary text, tells you perhaps how to approach it. I'm not going to tell you how to approach it. I mean, there are so many different ideologies, approaches, and there are so many books now, approaches to literature, approaches to critical theory, and so on and so forth. So when I studied at the MA level, uh, uh, various kinds of texts, which was historical, 19th century literature, the Romantic movement and the 19th century literature, Shakespeare, then 17th century literature, 18th century neoclassical literature, 19th century Romantic literature, 20th century modern literature. Right in 1970s, we were learning some of these texts, and it was text-based approach. So texts were prescribed, canonical texts were prescribed, institutionalized, and we were supposed to know those specific texts well as we were supposed to know texts around them. So if some 3 or 4 plays of Shakespeare have been prescribed, we are supposed to know many more plays of Shakespeare. We don't know how many, but many more. Okay. So, and it was, as I said, confined to English in a narrow sense of the term literature. We did not have Indian writing in English in 1970s. It was a separate paper. Indian writing in English would be a separate paper, which was not a compulsory part of the English course. Commonwealth literature, American literature was what we called a subsidiary course, an ancillary course, a course which was optional, elective. I did a 2-paper course in aesthetics. And the main teacher there was Professor R.B. Patankar, who was the head of the Department of English for many years. And I did my PhD after I came back from FLU or CIFL in 79. I did doctoral work with Professor Patankar. My doctoral work is on aesthetics of genre studies. So what is classification of literature? What is the basis for classification? And I have published that in the form of a book called Aesthetics of Literary Classification. So aesthetics at that time was a 2-paper elective course. I will talk to you about that. Now, how to teach literature? We read literature. Even outside universities, people read literature. But when you come to the institutionalized pedagogy, institutionalized, canonized pedagogy, you have to have a set of books. You have to have a genre to study. Maybe tragedy, maybe comedy, etc., etc. So whatever it is. Now, our exploratory question will be how to teach it. How to teach whatever you mean by English literature. How does one go about teaching and learning it within the institutional framework, within the framework of a syllabus and prescribed texts and so on. So there are 2 methods, a selection of texts which can be chronological, that is, start with Chaucer and come down right up to the 20th century. I do not know whether 21st century texts are incorporated today in the syllabus because I have stopped teaching after 2005, the MA courses. I'm not in touch, but you would know as teachers of English, you have to handle your own syllabuses and so on, and the kind of list of texts which you handle. So through the texts, partly chronological, partly thematic. So under tragedy as a form, you will study certain texts. Sometimes certain Greek texts in the Western tradition would be prescribed. tragedies of Sophocles or Aeschylus or Euripides, but mostly say tragedies of Shakespeare, etc., etc. So if you are studying a form or a genre, you study it thematically and still without giving up the chronological historical approach. So these two approaches or a mixture of them, the chronological approach and the thematic approach, will have to coexist in any teaching of literature. You can't give up chronology and also interpretative history, because Shakespeare cannot be understood and studied without reference to 16th and 17th century literature and the tradition to which he belongs. You can make that tradition narrow, or you can make it larger as the European tradition. And you can study literature in a thematic way. The themes of literature. What are the themes? And there was an experiment, I remember, in SNDT University, where for a couple of years, for some years, a few years, they taught literature completely thematically without much reference to the historical approach. But I think a combination of the two will have to be kept in mind, combination of history and themes. Okay, and obviously, as I said, issues of canonization do emerge. Which text to prescribe? The moment you prescribe a few texts, they have to be canonical texts. So there is a sense in which we encourage, we study, we sort of support a certain kind of canon by sheerly by simply selecting a few texts out of so many. So that, of course, is a complaint by feminists that, the canon has been completely lopsided, and a few women writers were then prescribed. We had Virginia Woolf, we had before that George Eliot, we had, women, but there was no, in 70s, early 70s, when I did my MA, there was no explicit movement called feminism within the Indian academies. It emerged in 80s and 90s. So we did not study the approach called, say, reading as a woman, so, or writing as a woman. These approaches, when I did my MA, were not very popular and not canonical at all. They have now become canonical because feminism is a part of critical theory now and becomes a canon, part of canon. So please remember, these issues of canon were also quite new to us. What is a canon? Nobody asked this question. We simply accepted a certain canon, studied it, and well, yes, Shakespeare has certain canonical texts, certain texts of Shakespeare. I mean, Shakespeare didn't say this is the canon, but we later, as teachers and readers and students, canonized those texts. We said that these 4 tragedies are so important, so rich, and etc., etc., whatever you want to say about them. And we have to study them. If we are studying Shakespearean literature or Elizabethan literature, these are the texts which become prominent. Now, who decides all that? These questions were not discussed at that time, even in the criticism and critical theory texts. I will tell you what we studied in criticism. We had an anthology. Today you will have some other anthology of criticism. At that time, some of you, I don't know, have you seen English critical texts? Note the title, English critical texts from 16th to 20th century. edited by De Chiquera and Enright, DJ Enright. DJ Enright was himself a Shakespearean scholar. He wrote excellent volumes on Shakespearean drama, DJ Enright. So these two editors edited a text, an anthology called English Critical Texts. So our approach was more more textual than thematic. The themes used to emerge, sort of, or they were supposed to emerge from the texts. The themes were not separately discussed, nor were the papers discussed under specific headings. They were chronologically arranged. Philip Sidney, An Apology of Poetry; Dryden, Pope, Essay on Criticism; Samuel Johnson, Preface to Shakespeare; William Wordsworth's Preface to Lyrical Ballads. Unfortunately, Coleridge was chapters from Biographia Literaria were not prescribed, but we were expected to read them. Shelley's Defense of Poetry, Arnold's Study of Poetry, Lawrence, Why the Novel Matters, T.S. Eliot, two papers, Tradition and Individual Talent and Metaphysical Poets, and Lewis, Keats, F.R. Lewis. So this anthology is a textual anthology, chronologically arranged, 16th to 20th century critics. You have now maybe a better anthology, going far beyond English criticism, as I said, David Lodge, Modern Criticism and Theory. And now theory has been incorporated. This English critical text was first, I think, published in 69 or something. 69 or 79, I don't remember. No, not 79, 69, because we studied it in 1972 for our MA. David Lodge published, edited and published his book called Modern Criticism and Theory with an introduction. It is arranged, the table of contents is arranged in two ways: chronologically or historically, from Saussure to Umberto Eco. That is a chronological arrangement. And thematically, there are 6 broad themes which he mentions. Formalism and structuralism is one, deconstruction is another, psychoanalysis is third, politics, Marxism, etc., cultural history is fourth, feminism is fifth, and hermeneutics is sixth. Okay, so these were the 6 themes. If you want to study it thematically, you can go ahead and read those texts. If you want to do it chronologically, you can go on starting with Saussure and come down to Eco. So as you can see, Lodge himself does not support either. He simply organizes them in 2 different ways in the table of contents itself, which means there's a lot of hesitation whether we should go on teaching criticism chronologically, historically, or thematically. There's a huge difference between the two. You specify topics, not even isms, but you specify topics. That's how we studied aesthetics. You specify topics. What is literature? How to approaches to literature, etc., reading of literature, analyzing literature, whatever. There would be topics, and the texts would be used as more as examples. This is one approach. This is thematic approach. The other approach is keep texts at the center and then let issues emerge. Let issues emerge. Take, for example, Rakesh mentioned I have translated Barthes and Foucault. I have translated Barthes' What is an Author, and Foucault's What is an Author, and Barthes' Death of the Author. So these are certain themes, here it is called the authorship theme, emerges out of these two papers, and a debate follows. Who is an author? What is an author? Is the author dead? If the author, the moment a text is circulated, is the author dead? If it is dead, then why are people studying and meeting and interviewing authors? Are they committing intentional fallacies and so on and so forth? These issues are very, very important. And why did, for example, to go to the very basic question, why did Foucault and Barthes themselves put their names on their texts? We study it as Roland Barthes text, we study it as Michel Foucault text. Well, what is the relevance of Foucault or Barthes if the author is dead? Author is just an excuse to read a text. So all these problems will emerge the moment you start studying literature thematically rather than author-wise or text-wise. Okay, the nature of textuality is such that it brings in issues of creativity and authorship, and it also brings in certain issues about freedom of reading and interpretation, irrespective of the author's intentions. Irrespective, completely irrespective. That's a kind of modern and postmodern view, that author's intention is only one way of reading a text. Shakespeare, we cannot interview Shakespeare, obviously. And how do we decide what was Shakespeare's intention in writing Othello, Lear, or any of his plays? So intentional fallacy, those papers are very important, which came in the mid 20th century, challenging the traditional notions of author's intention, authorship, and the notions, romantic notions of creative writing, creativity in writing. So all these isms, formalism, structuralism, deconstruction, they do not take the traditional notion of the author. The author, nature of authorship has changed. In all these isms, the 20th century, which emerged perhaps starting with Russian formalism and then structuralism, deconstruction, psychoanalysis was already there in the early part of the 20th century. Marxism, in fact, was there late 19th and early 20th century. And then later developments into cultural history or cultural criticism, feminism, hermeneutics, reader response, and so on. A more recent anthology, 1998, which perhaps people follow today, is Davis and Schleifer's edited Contemporary Literary Criticism, Literary and Cultural Studies. That's a huge anthology, much more inclusive than the first two I have mentioned. It starts with self-reflexive questions. That's the difference now. In 90s, it became much more prominent to discuss what is literary studies, to ask questions about literary studies itself. What is literary theory? So these questions were not so consciously discussed. We accepted certain definitions of literature, certain definitions of studying literature, and so on. But the more self-reflexive attempts were made in 70s, 80s, and 90s. In 60s and 70s, people accepted the canonical ways of studying literature, pedagogy, and so on. So the then and now contrast, you have to see how within India, I don't know, I am not educated in a foreign university. I am a product of Indian universities, all through Indian institutes. So CIFL, Bombay University, Elphinstone College, they are all Indian institutes, okay? And that is how English was taught. And English was quite insulated, okay? My father was the first to introduce interdisciplinary studies and linguistic studies into Marathi literature. He was a professor of Marathi, so he tried his best. But English literature was quite insular, and it did not incorporate literatures in English of other traditions. Even American literature was called American literature, Commonwealth literature, African literature, Indian writing in English, and so on and so forth. So these were quite diversified, and if you want to study them, you can study, but the core of literature was English literature in England, because it had a long tradition from Chaucer to Eliot, say. So fine, the canonical texts were defined and redefined and so on and so forth. So what I'm saying is, in this anthology of 98, called Contemporary Literary Criticism, Literature and Literary and Cultural Studies, it starts with some self-reflexive questions. What is literary studies? What is literary theory? And then turns to themes like feminism, themes like um, uh, and modernity and postmodernity become issues in this. Okay, pre-modern, post-modern, and postmodern. The three phases are discussed and rediscussed and explored and re-explored, and a lot of research has gone into it. And then traditions which are not normally incorporated in literature, because literature means something which is written. What happens to oral traditions in literature? So orality was completely ignored in mid-century, 20th century literature courses. No study of oral literary traditions. Only some ballads, and they are all literary. And you must have read a book by Empson called, written in the early part of the 20th century. It's uh, one of his very unusual books. Not only seven forms of ambiguity, but some forms of pastoral. Some forms of pastoral. It's a wonderful book. Please read it. Now, what is pastoral? And again, pastoral gets canonized. Okay. Eclogues and so on and so forth. So please go and read that book called Some Versions of Pastoral by William Empson. Um, this is what criticism and critical theory have been, the way they have been taught to my generation. And my generation means a generation before me and a generation after me. That is, people who did their MA in, say, early or mid 70s to early and mid 80s. But by 80s, things are changing. A lot of new things are happening. The moment I completed my MA, Bombay University started changing its syllabuses. And as a teacher of English literature, I had to reinvent ways of studying English literature, because a lot of things had happened by that time. By 80s, mid 80s, new things are happening within the Indian academia. So if somebody tells you Indian academia is very static, don't believe that. There have been changes, drastic changes. And for example, Bhagyashree's generation and my generation, there will be a lot of difference between the texts, the way we studied texts, the texts we studied, and the kind of self-reflection which followed in 80s and 90s. Let me now, having said this, I don't know how you study criticism today, Bhagyashree. Is it textual or thematic?
Mostly we prescribe the text, sir, and critical theories also. We
Yeah.
give essays like essay from Derrida.
Yeah,
Uh,
I have taught that. I have, as an example of structuralism, we will teach Barth. As an example
yeah,
of post-structuralism, we'll teach
yeah,
Foucault
yeah,
or Derrida, and so
yeah,
on. Okay, not Foucault, but Derrida mainly, and
yeah.
so on and so forth. And then there are approaches, various kinds of approaches, structural approaches, post-structural approaches,
Yes.
and so on, feminist approaches, and so on. So, no, but is the syllabus arranged according to topics or according to texts? That's my question today in Bombay University at MA level.
Yeah,
The criticism paper
yes, sir.
has
Yeah,
texts mainly.
yes,
You prescribe text because I have taught that syllabus in 90s,
yeah,
mid 90s. Yes, I think it remains like that.
yes,
Okay, now let me tell you something about aesthetics. Okay, um, the term aesthetics emerged in the Western world around 18th century as it is used today. Aesthesis, which is not used as a common word in English, aesthesis means feeling, feeling, not really emotion, but feeling, the sense perception and the feeling. Okay, so a study of that, ix means study, a study of aesthesis was called, I think it was coined by a German philosopher called Baumgarten.
yeah,
Okay, and 17th, 18th century Germany. And this became so popular. A British tradition emerged of aesthetics, an American tradition emerged, and European traditions emerged, and so on and so forth. So, aesthetics does not have a modern parallel term in Indian languages. If you want to turn to aesthetics in India, you have to go to ancient texts like Natya Shastra. And Natya Shastra is around 200 BC to 200 AD. And the main theory there is the Rasa theory
yeah,
in Natya Shastra. The Rasa theory, Bhava and Rasa theory. Okay, and there are definite parallels between the ancient Indian aesthetic theory as it is propounded in Natya Shastra and the subsequent tradition which lasted for about 8, 9 centuries, right up to Abhinav Gupta.
yeah,
So, if you want to study Indian aesthetics, you have to study, of course, there are different approaches again to canonization of Sanskrit aesthetics also, and you can decenter Natya Shastra, but you can't avoid it. Avoid going back to Natya Shastra because it's a compendium of ideas and approaches which were formalized by um, 200 BC to 200 AD. And I'm sure many performing artists, dance, drama, music, because Natya does not mean in Sanskrit drama. Natya means theater. And theater, the theatrical arts, the performing arts, are arts which are performed on the stage. Ranga Bhumi. So Ranga becomes very important. The concept of Ranga. Ranga Bhumi. So dance, music, and drama. But they separated. Gradually they separated. Natak became an art, music became an art, Sangeet, and Nritya. Okay, so it is Nritya and Natya which go closely together because Nritya also, uh, through body movements, expresses certain rasas and bhavas and so on and so forth. Music remains only at the level of vocalization or instrumentalization. So, through instrumental music, through vocal music, the entire body does not come into the picture. Okay. To a certain extent in performances, yes. Yeah, you want to ask something, Bhagishri?
No, sir. I just see the next person is joining, so I will admit Dr. T.S. Anand.
Sorry,
And
sorry.
you continue, sir.
Okay, okay,
Dr. T.S. Anand is here from Canada, so I
okay,
am just allowing him to
okay. Yeah,
join.
yeah. I'll wind up in 10 minutes time,
Yeah,
five
you
to
just,
seven
yes,
minutes time.
yes, sir.
I'm
Welcome,
talking
Dr.
about
Anand.
the final part of aesthetics.
Yes, sir.
Okay, aesthetics we studied, it was at that time studied as a part of philosophy rather than of literature courses. In philosophy, philosophy looks at itself, looks at itself in the form of its method, which is logic. Then it has branches like epistemology or jnana, what is knowledge, metaphysics, what is there existence beyond physical existence, called metaphysics, beyond physical. Then third part of aesthetics is called, today that word is gone out of fashion, but axiology. Axiology means mulya mimamsa, analysis of values. And basically two basic types of values: ethical values and aesthetic values. Ethical values and aesthetic values. And aesthetics was approached from the point of general aesthetics and from the point of view of aesthetics of particular art. So there is literary aesthetics, there is aesthetics of music, aesthetics of painting, aesthetics of film, aesthetics of dance and drama, and so on. This is the thematic part of it. And there is also the tradition of Western aesthetics, centering around Kant in the 18th century and Abhinav Gupta in the 9th century. So we studied these under aesthetics as sort of a discipline under a kind of rubric called meta-criticism. So it gives you further insights into the theoretical, philosophical aspects of literary criticism and also art criticism, other forms of art. So if you have any questions, I've just reviewed what we studied for what we did for the last 30, 40 years, how things have changed, we have incorporated. Now I think the main change is that aesthetics is not taught at Bombay University. That is the main change. The study of aesthetics has disappeared from the English department. So maybe there are people, difficult to find people who can teach it, and so on and so forth. So
Yes.
let me now stop here, having sort of raised certain issues while giving you a historical perspective from 1970s to say to say 2000 or beginning of the 21st century.